This is Heather Riggs at the NEMA office. I just want to make sure that we find out where everybody's calling in from or viewing on the web. So if you guys can type in the chat feature where you're from, that would be great, so you can see exactly who else is on the call today. And if you're new to Lunch with NEMA, this is actually going to be how you chat with us. So if you have any questions for our presenter, just type them in the chat feature and I will ask him the questions. We will be taking the Q&A at the end of the presentation, but go ahead and type them in if you do have something that you're thinking of in the meantime. Oh, it's wonderful. So everybody is from all over New England. Awesome to see. We have some new names today, which is really nice to see too. Okay, now that you guys know how to use the chat feature, we will start the Lunch with NEMA. Just to let you know that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the NEMA website probably later on this afternoon, if not tomorrow morning. And also a copy of John's PowerPoint presentation will be available to download later on, just to let you know on that one. And I want to introduce John. He is a museum analyst, planner, and producer, and is president of White Oak Associates, located in Marblehead, Massachusetts. He's also the former associate director of the Museum of Science. John has worked with over a couple hundred museums internationally throughout the United States on multiple projects. I will let him explain a little bit more on that one. He's also written several articles and books. So John, I'm going to let you take it away.
Happy to do that, Heather. If you want to shift over to the first slide of my piece, that'll be fine. We can use that as a holding piece while I talk through some kind of opening comments here. And I think there's some history to this research project that I'm presenting today. After 4 decades of strategic planning for museums internationally, with all kinds of museums, my partner Jeannie Stahl and I formed the White Oak Institute in 2007, and the purpose of the Institute was to research the museum field as a whole. We collected a huge amount of data for individual projects, comparing museums as individual operations. And we formed this research field because we care so much about the museum field, but felt that it needed some frameworks, it needed shared language, it needed standards to work with. So we had contracts for projects with the IMLS, with the National Science Foundation, and we partnered with AAM and ACM and Aztec and other museum organizations to do specific projects. And then we were able to do some of our own research to build on the kind of resources that we collected in doing that, and you'll see some of that today. In doing this, what we wanted to do was to understand how and why museums do what they do. We've been in the field for all of our careers. We care deeply about museums, but why do museums do what they do, and how is it that we all share some process? Because it's a time really of increased accountability and pressure to evidence our value as museums. It's fortunately a time of greater interdisciplinary connection among museums. We're not quite as siloed as we used to be. And certainly the desire to reach out to other kinds of museums in our community or with our audience is important. And it's now a time really to share language and to share the research that we do. So I want to share these findings today. We came up with about that question. The full version of the research with all the citations and all the background is available in my 2016 book, Measuring Museum Impact and Performance. And I'll show you that later on. The findings really apply to any museum. They apply globally, but as a result, they're somewhat abstract, somewhat broad, and I therefore want to start all this with a couple of concrete examples so that you know what I'm talking about. And I thought at first maybe that I would take examples from different sectors, but I decided it would be more relevant to this discussion if I chose 3 aquariums that had similar missions. And these 3 aquariums all share a mission of environmental stewardship, said in different ways. It might be biodiversity conservation, it might be ocean health, but all of them are really about environmental stewardship in their mission statements. So the National Aquarium in Baltimore did a longitudinal study by John Falk and Lynn Dierking, maybe even a decade ago or more. And they discovered that, yes, the aquarium was having its mission impact on visitors. They did change their behavior and were more aware of their role in preserving biodiversity, conserving biodiversity, or environmental stewardship. But that didn't last very long. 3 years later, that influence was pretty much gone. So they had a short-term impact, but not a long-term impact on their mission. However, the Aquarium of Americas is very much still there. It's doing a huge amount of traffic flow, as it were, and it plays a role in Baltimore that's very different from just environmental conservation. It is a landmark for the Inner Harbor. It is an economic driver of tourism, and it's a provider of wonderful family experiences. So it provides much more than its mission. The Aquarium of the Americas in New Orleans was built up on the riverfront and moved a lot of the activity out of the Vieux Carré up onto a higher level with a new convention center, and kind of really changed the urban dynamics of New Orleans and vastly expanded the tourism market with hotels and walkways and other features that are there. So yes, it's preserving its mission, but it's also playing an urban role, a kind of development role. Here in Boston, the New England Aquarium launched the Simons IMAX Theater. And yes, during the day they show IMAX films that are about ocean conservation, environmental issues. But at night they show Tom Cruise doing Mission Impossible, and they use the IMAX theater to show Hollywood blockbuster movies. Is that anti-mission? Well, it certainly doesn't directly support the mission. But if you look at that from the community viewpoint, if you look at that from downtown activity, certainly the theater there plays a significant role in keeping that area around Quincy Market and the waterfront vitally active at night and a destination for many to come to. So all three of these aquariums are providing value to their communities way beyond their stated mission. And that, I think, is a fundamental concept that weaves through these findings. We as museums provide far more value than we are counting ourselves or than the society is counting for us. So that finding will be detailed throughout this. So let's move on to an outline of today's presentations. I'll talk through some assumptions and definitions. We'll look at the research on the why, we'll look at the research on the how, museum and what they do, and we'll figure out how to apply those findings, and hopefully have some time for Q&A before we end. All this is based on Stephen Weil's theory, wonderful Stephen Weil, the great sage of museum writing. And he said, you know, it doesn't matter what your building is worth. It doesn't matter what your collection is worth. What it matters is what difference you're making in the world. How are you helping the world be a better place? What change are you making? How are you making people's lives a little better? So I've expanded that into the value of a museum is the cumulative value of the impacts and benefits it delivers. These words will have a little bit more meaning as we go along, but it's essentially saying that the value of a museum is what you do. So we have some assumptions here. The first one is, seems to be in evidence what's going on. Museums pursue multiple purposes, and we deliver multiple impacts and benefits. This is somewhat heretical because museums are supposed to be mission focused, supposed to be really focused on just delivering on their mission, and everything else is ancillary. Well, the reality is that we're very good at actually providing and chasing multiple purposes. Secondly, there's a great deal of literature on the public value of museums and how we help society as a whole, but much less attention to the private, personal, and institutional values that we provide. We provide private foundations and corporations with value. We provide individuals with value, and we certainly provide value back to the museum itself. Some operating data, which is generally thought of as outputs, may actually indicate impacts and benefits or outcomes. A lot of the evaluation community really feels that we need to do qualitative analysis to come up with impact and outcome, but there is some operating data that may indicate impact, and I'll explain that a little bit more. Each museum is unique and must determine its measurement standards. There is no one measurement standards for all museums. It's not as though attendance or working capital or any given number can score a museum or even a collection of numbers. Each museum determines what its purposes are and needs to determine how it's going to score itself. It's got to be public and transparent about that, but ultimately it's your choice, not some kind of systemic thing done by the field or by external fields. We also need to think holistically about who we serve in our context. We often talk about visitors, and I find most people just automatically assume that a museum's impact is going to be on its visitors. Certainly that's a big area of impact, but museums have a huge impact and provide benefits to far more audiences and to the community as a whole. So if we look at this diagram here with the idea that the community and its tourists is the biggest picture, and that subdivides into the museum's audience and supporters and the non-users. There are benefits that a non-user gets from a museum, but let's just focus on the audiences and supporters. Here is the sort of standard part, the visitors that come to the galleries, the exhibit galleries, so that little link there is what most people think of as museum audiences. But in fact, we have other venues. We have program participants that are on-site or off-site or virtual. And we have our public supporters, government supporters, and private supporters who are involved with the museum in board meetings, in donor and foundation program officers, as well as volunteers, so that there's a lot of people who are involved. So a museum's total engagements is made up of the sum of its support engagements, its visitor engagements, and its program engagements. And that's a much bigger number than most people count for just the visitation on site. So looking at the word outcome and impacts and benefits, these are three words that are broadly similar, but they're important distinctions. When a museum talks about its impacts, it's what the museum wants to do to its audience and supporters. What impact do you want to have on your audience? Benefits are what the audience and supporters get from the museum. What does a visitor get from it? Well, they get a quality visitor experience, or they get a good time with friends and family, or the supporters get results for their own particular agenda of community services and social benefits. So those two words, impacts and benefits, are broadly similar, but not entirely. So museums are free choice learning institutions. And by that we mean that they really have a business model which is based on the idea that no one has to go to or fund a museum. Unlike schools, where students have to go to school, no visitor has to come to a museum, no donor has to continue their payment. Even if some of these things are legislated, we all have had experiences where the legislation has changed the assignment. So in order to get people to engage with the museum, we have to attract and deliver value to get value in return. We have to be the providers of value to our audiences and supporters. And when those people who are choosing to spend their time, effort, or money on the museum are experts, then their exchanges of value may indicate the value of the impacts and benefits. If teachers choose to come back more frequently, that may be an indicator that teachers are finding value, and they're experts in that field, so they should know. And I can look at that for program officers at foundations. I can look at that for higher levels of membership. And there are a whole bunch of experts who are engaged on the audience side. So let's move now to why do museums do what they do after looking at those definitions and assumptions. All right, so the research sample that we used for the why, the purposes, is a database of indicators of impact and performance known as the Museum Indicators of Impact and Performance MIP 1.0. We'll show you how you can download this Excel database if you want. It's free. It has over 1,000 indicators. They've been collected from 51 expert sources, and many of them are already tested in standardized data fields. So the 51 sources are data collection fields like the AAM's survey, or the one that the White Oak Institute did for the IMLS that was going to be the basis of their National Museums Count survey. Evaluation criteria and institutional evaluation come from foundations and other museums as to how they evaluate their work. Foundation objectives come from the National Science Foundation, or Kresge, as to how they select grantees. Management resources are things like various MAP and other assessments. Many museum leaders have proposed indicators of success, and there's a whole bunch of research findings, and there's many of those, including such things as Britain Thinks, which was a survey done in England of how the British people valued the museums in the UK and what they thought the value of the museums were to them. So we have research findings like that from Australia and from various other parts of the country, including the United States. So those gave us 1,000 indicators. And just so you know what we're talking about in indicators, here's some sample indicators. How many partnerships with other organizations do you manage simultaneously? And these numbers are the number of that indicator in the overall 1,000. So that's an indicator of the social networking that the museum is involved in. And the number of partnerships may be an indicator of how much civic bonding the organization is responsible for. Articles per staff member, 2.73 at the Natural History Museum in London. That's an indicator of how much the museum is contributing to public knowledge. Ranking by school teachers is important to them in the classroom. It's an indicator of how the museum is providing value to the K-12 system. Number of international tourists annually is an indicator of economic impact to a community. Net Promoter Score, how likely are you to recommend this experience to others, is an indicator of the personal benefit that a visitor might get from a museum and want to share with friends and colleagues. So those are the kinds of indicators and how they might be used to be categorized to show what impact they might measure. So here are the 12 external impacts that the research came up with, the 12 whys of a museum. And they're grouped according to their typical funding sources. The public impacts are typically funded by support funds, often public funds. And the private impacts are typically funded by corporations and foundations, and sometimes economic development agencies. And the personal impacts are often funded by those individuals and are really the earned revenue aspects of a museum's exchanges. So public impacts, we can broaden participation. I think we all know what that's about, including preserving heritage. Strengthening social capital is about, is multi-layered actually. It's adding to the building structures of a community, but it's also forming relationships. It's also creating the kinds of networks that allow leaders in the community to be in touch with each other. Enhancing public knowledge is adding to value either by doing research on the collections or by doing research on learning and how people learn in museums. Serving education is helping teachers with teacher training and doing school programs. Advancing social change is some of the work that we've been doing in the green movement and in trying to bridge cultural groups. So advancing social change is about changing behaviors to help society. Communicating public identity and image is being a symbol for certain kinds of things, like the Tech Museum and Innovation at Silicon Valley is a symbol for technology. And we've got all sorts of museums that serve a symbolic role in their community. Contributing to the economy is jobs and tourism and workforce development and all those things that create a strong economy in the future. Museums are very active in that area. Delivering corporate community services. Many of the corporations in our communities have a pledge to help the community, help their workers and employees use that community more thoroughly and create quality of life for their workers. And museums can help the corporations do that. On the personal side, enabling personal growth is the biggest area in this area, where learning and intrinsic experiences like joy and appreciation of beauty and art, but also identity development. Who am I, and what are the kinds of careers I want to pursue? And gee, how do I learn more about dinosaurs, or how do I learn more about Renoir? Offering personal respite for people who are looking for safe places to be, and maybe a memorial of some sort, or a way to get away from the hurly-burly of the world. And lastly, welcoming personal leisure, how to have a place to have fun, a place to be enjoyed. So these are 12 external. There are also 2 internal, which is building museum capital and helping museum operations. And we can look at and code the indicators according to that. But more importantly, the indicators really revealed that. There was only one indicator that talked about personal respite, for instance. Actually, there were 4 of them. But that was enough in the sample to say, yes, this is a benefit that does exist. Let's think about it. So in looking at that list, we also need to realize that the same list can be labeled as benefits. That the public benefits by broadening participation, by having its heritage preserved, etc. And that's certainly more true down at the bottom. The individual benefits by having a growth experience, by having a wonderful, beautiful experience, by having a place to get away, by having a place to have fun. And they're willing to pay money for that, and they're willing to spend their time and effort to come there. So the questions that really devolve on each of you as an organization is, which of these impact and benefits does your museum deliver? And I think if you went down the list, you'd probably say, well, all of them to some degree. We may not even be a collecting institution, but we do preserve records of this or that, or we do have some items that are worth saving. So yeah, we've been preserving heritage. So maybe you do all of them to some degree, but which of those are most important to you? Which are the ones that you are your desired impacts, the ones that you really want to have happen? And which of those perceived benefits are most valued by your audiences and supporters? Which are the things that they spend the most time, effort, and money on, and as an indicator of relative importance? And how well do they align? Is this okay? You know, is this something that you're comfortable with, that the impacts that you want and the perceived benefits that people are getting from you are different, or is there a way of making adjustments that would help bring them into alignment? So if you want to get MIP 1.0, there's the website, and as Heather said, this is available for you to download if you want. It's on White Oak Associates Library, and it's currently featured. And rename it, and then you can delete and change it, and filter it for whatever your needs are. You can filter it according to those impacts that you feel are your important impacts, and see what everybody else is doing in the way of measurements. So let's move on to the how here. How do museums do what they do? And in this thing, we started with a different research base because the question is fundamentally different. It's much more qualitative. Value. So we looked at 11 evaluation frameworks that are common to the museum field. And then we did a literature search of when people talk about institutional evaluation, what are the models that they bring to it? And you probably know Mark Moore's strategic triangle. It's something that applies to many nonprofits. There is the whole theory-based evaluation and logic model academic field. Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great, has got a way of how he thinks businesses are successful. There's a lot of museum theories, starting with Dana and working through John Falk and Lynn Dierking and George Hine and Stephen Weil. So there's some great theories that have been developed about how museums do what they do. Project evaluation frameworks from places like the National Science Foundation that look at how a project can be evaluated may have applications to institutional evaluation. Mark St. John and Deborah Perry's infrastructure model looked at evaluating museums as though they were infrastructure or bridges or highways, something that was necessary to a community. Carol Scott's typology looked at different kinds of values, and she came up with a set of definitions and a framework for it. Jeff Mulgan, who was a cabinet minister in England, came up with a list of indicator types. And then we have operating and evaluation data from multiple sources, and then a full set of accounting definitions. So we looked at all of those, and they had underlying steps. All of these evaluation frameworks identified a need, came up with a means, figured out the audience, and said what are the ends that they want to have happen. What's the need and what's the means, or a museum in our case, with all of its resource, the audience, the museum's visitors or program participants, and how you're going to change them so that the ends address the need. Very simple kind of step. The Kellogg Foundation has kind of set the basis for what a logic model is. You start with resources. You've got some amount of money, some amount of talent, some amount of stuff and buildings. You use that for activities, and those activities generate outputs, i.e. the number of visits, and outcomes, the number of transformed individuals, and that has a cumulative impact. So that's a logic model. So what we did in our research was to overlay all 11 of these into one kind of matrix, and they all share this kind of left to right external input to the means, to an audience interface, to the ends. And I won't take you through all of the different steps, but you can see that at the bottom line here, if you kind of look down these columns, the common elements is that there is a community need, a desired benefit, and the museum decides on its intentional purposes, what it's going to address of those needs. And it uses its guiding principles or values to filter that, and then looks to its resources. What do we have that we can use to address those purposes? And what activities can we do on them? And what's the operating data that we get out of that? And what's the key performance indicators? And does that result in benefits and values, perceived benefits and values? And let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So this is the synthesized museum theory of action that really results from bringing together all 11 of those theories into one common kind of theory. And it's a very simple theory to state. It may look complicated here in this box diagram, but it really says that, and I'll just repeat what I went through because it's useful to go back over it. But we start, as Dana talked about, the museum meets the community's needs. It is responsive to the public, private, personal, and institutional needs. And in that, decides on its intentional purposes, a number of them, not necessarily this many, but some number of intentional purposes. You filter that through your guiding principles, your values of things like, well, We believe in authenticity, and we believe in quality, and we believe in community engagement, etc. And then you look at your resources. Well, we've got staff, we've got a collection, we've got building, we've got skills at doing things, we've got a reputation. And you put those through museum activities. Let's do exhibitions and camp-ins and programs and outreach and other activities. And you then collect operating and evaluation data, both from the counts and from surveys. And you put those into formulas, which we'll call key performance indicators. And that tells you what the nature of the public benefits and private benefits and personal and institutional benefits, all of which loop all the way back to the needs. So this is really a cycle that you go through trying to improve the efficiency of it. And it is your theory of action. It says, we believe that if we want to do X and we use our resources and activities, that we will achieve X prime as an outcome. And that our theory of action is that we'll do it by monitoring, by mounting exhibits. So let's move on to applying the findings here. And come back to this distinction between impacts and benefits. Do your desired impacts align with their perceived benefits? And let me use an example of this back to the aquarium and bring in a children's museum example. So an aquarium maybe try to have an impact on people's awareness and behavior of the need for environmental stewardship. The audience comes there, as research shows, for Marilyn Hood's and others' research. They come there for a good time, a quality time with friends and family, for the opportunity of new experiences, and yes, for the ability to learn something new, but that's usually third or lower on their list. They're there for a good time with friends and family in most cases. There's no clear alignment with that. They're not in conflict, but it means that the museum, the aquarium in this case, has to spend money and effort to do both, has to deliver its impact, and it has to deliver a quality value, a quality visitor experience. A children's museum is more inherently aligned. The mission of a children's museum is to help with child development, and most parents who bring toddlers and young kids to a museum are really caring about their child's development and are watching carefully how that child goes through the dump and fill stage with buckets of sand or whatever. So that both the customers and the institution are aligned around the impact and benefit of child development. So it becomes a policy choice then as to whether you want to live with that alignment or perhaps change your impacts to more aligned. So let's look at value exchanges. If we are a free choice institution and we really respect our customers, we respect the opinions and the choices that our visitors and donors and supporters give us, then we can look at the money that they choose to spend on us, operating revenues, not capital money, but operating revenue, which comes as earned and support revenue. We can look at the effort, the amount of trouble they go to, and we count those as museum engagements, site visits or attendance. So every site visit is an evidence of effort spent by the individual. And time, the amount of time that they spend there. We don't count that as much. Dwell time has not been recorded by many museums because many museums lack the kind of parking ticket mechanism or timed entrance and exit mechanisms that allow you to count it efficiently. So I'm very much in favor of the free museum, of removing admission barriers, but I also recognize that those are not the only barriers. Effort is a big barrier, and we have to think about that too. It's partially why outreach and why virtual engagements are important to museums. A tourist in a downtown hotel has far more time and ability to go visit a museum in downtown than somebody who may be living in an outlying neighborhood and may have a family of 7 and may be pressed for transportation options to get into town. So the effort for that more suburban family to come in is far greater than it is for the tourists to roll out of their hotel and down the street to a museum. And we need to think through those different barriers. But we also need to recognize that once they're crossed, they are a testament to the museum that we're offering some kind of value, particularly that they repeat year after year. So let's look at key performance indicators and what we call key impact indicators. Most of you, I'm sure, are using key performance indicators in some fashion for basic operational things like what's our utility dollars per square foot, and can we reduce the heating bill? But as I said, some of this operating data may indicate impact, and those are we call key impact indicators, such as a teacher retention rate or a volunteer staff time indicator, or the amount of awards that we get from program officers who trust the museum to do work for it. So there are some of these data fields that can help us indicate the results. We think that museums really need to record both quantitative and qualitative data to do institutional evaluation. So operating data and survey scales are quantitative numbers, basically. Qualitative, opinions by focus group and evaluation, those are opinions and thoughts, if you will. Both are useful, and we're seeing organizations like Facebook and Google do both. They have lots of numeric data, but they also do focus groups and they also do surveys to find out what's behind that data. So the mantra of measuring constantly quantitative data and validating qualitatively periodically is important. You may think that your volunteer program is offering higher value because volunteers are enlisting in it more often and spending more time in it. But it may be that there's a new bus service or that some other volunteer organization is shut down. So you have to actually ask them every once in a while whether they're coming more because they like it more. So those two together have to be used. And the logic sequence of how you use these to evaluate the museum is to take one of your intentional purposes, define what the desired outcomes, what's the change you want to see happen in the world because of that purpose, and therefore what's the indicator? How do we measure that? And what is the data that we have to collect in order to measure that indicator? And yes, periodically, let's do some evaluation to test that. So that sort of stacks up this way, where the center column here takes intentional purpose number 2 and maybe says that there are 3 desired impacts for that. And of the center one, well, we've got a KPI here and here and here, and there are the data fields, and here's how we'll test it periodically. So you can see that as you go through all of this, there's a number of data fields that you'll be collecting under each of these. Sometimes they'll be identical and be shared, but in many cases they'll be customized by the museum to serve your unique purposes. So let me do an example. Maybe a museum has a primary mission of engaging people in art or improving science literacy. But this might be a secondary, which is contributing social value. Well, the way we're going to try to contribute social value is, one of them is to strengthen civic connections. And we'll know that we've strengthened civic connections if the museum's leadership and team reflect the city's diversity, if our partnership network is growing, if our managers spend their time in community work, if corporations support the museum as they do our peers. So those are indicators, and underneath each of those indicators there are data fields and some ways of actually asking museums, whether they're supporting civic connections. And same for enriching the quality of life in our city or building regional identity and engagement. So all those are ways we can contribute social value. Underneath them are indicators of what that change might be, and their ways of measuring that. So back to this indicator chart, you can see how each of these gets down, and you can get down to the point where you've got all these data fields that you're measuring, feeding into some kind of a impact data dashboard, as opposed to just an operational dashboard to monitor your performance. So back to these key questions. Which of these 12 impacts and benefits does your museum deliver? Which of those are most important to you? Which of those perceived benefits are most valued by your audience? And how well do they align? And is this okay? Or do you want to change what benefits you're intentional about? Or do you want to downgrade some things that are selling well, but really outside of your business line? Or do you want to change your business line so you're delivering the benefits that your community wants? Anyway, that's the kind of ways that you can apply all this. All of this is laid out in my 2016 book, Measuring Museum Impact and Performance. Ford Dell wrote the introduction to that because we with the AAM were really in partnership with developing these ideas when we did that contract for the IMLS in 2012. So this has the more scholarly approach for those two research projects and how they went. A summary of it will be available in my next book coming out in, I trust, early December, the Museum Manager's Compendium, which has 101 tools. One of those is the audience framework. Another one might be the impact framework. So that is what I wanted to cover today at lunch. I hope it's useful to you all. In many ways, it's a new way of thinking about museums that are not mission-centric, but rather community service museums trying to do multiple things for multiple audiences, which provide us with a kind of diversified revenue stream that has helped us survive since Dana's time back in the early 1900s. So thank you all for your attention. I'm certainly happy to take questions. And I'll turn it back over to Heather to moderate any questions.
Okay, so if you guys do have any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat feature. And I want to say the file that John linked to is massive and it has a lot of information on it. I'm actually working with him on another project, and yeah, that one is pretty impressive what you've been able to compile and stuff on that one.
Good.
Is there any questions so far? I think you covered a lot and you asked a lot of questions that I think a lot of people are probably like trying to process through if they do that or not, or how they can do that, or
yeah.
You know, what data they should be collecting and tracking and things like that. So definitely.
Yeah, I know that this is
a lot there.
Well, I hope that all this makes perfect sense to everybody who heard it. When you kind of sit back and look at it and say, wow, that's different from what we've been doing, because so many museums are really about trying to focus on their mission, and they do things like these diagrams that have 4 quadrants, and in the upper right is high mission and high margin, and in the lower left is low margin, low mission. And then there's the high mission, low margin side. And we always feel ambivalent about that, those lines of business where we're making a lot of money, but that seems to be outside of our purview. And yet there's a great demand for it. Well, the humility might be to say, well, wait a minute, isn't that something we should be intentional about? And if we really care about that revenue source, don't we actually need to do a damn good job of delivering on it? Because otherwise, you know, some commercial organization is going to provide it efficiently.
So I do have a question that came in. It's from Paul, and he says, suggestions for how to devote staff time resources to collecting data. Do you need to hire a full-time evaluator?
It's a good question. Many museums eventually get a full-time evaluator. The Museum of Science has got an impressive array, but first let me deal with the time question in general. Deciding what your intentional purposes are and how you're going to count them is a very similar kind of activity to strategic planning. And in fact, it is strategic planning. So if you're thinking of going into a strategic planning session, and that often takes an institution 6 months to a year to go through that. It may be just as productive to go through a process like this that results not only in clarity about what your intentional purposes might be, but in a set of metrics that you can go to the board and say, here's how we're going to be measuring ourselves. And once you've done that, you save an awful lot of wasted time on spurious arguments about whether you're actually achieving your goals or not. Because if it's all anecdotal, and if all you're doing is reporting and reading letters from school kids and doing other things like that, but don't have numbers, today's boards lose patience with much of that, and they're expecting to see numbers. So the field as a whole needs to move over more toward a quantitative accountability just because of pressures from our community and from our donors. Not so much our visitors anymore, but maybe even that will happen. So do you need a full-time evaluator? Not necessarily. A small museum could do this with a chief financial officer who is reporting the data that the group as a whole decide needs to be reported. Some of the data may come from a ticketing system, and some of it may come from the financial records. But you do maybe want to have a contract, if not an individual, who can occasionally do surveys or help you administer surveys at the ticket booth on incoming visitors.
And then to answer Kathleen's question, there's sometimes there is a slight pause in it. It's the software issue. It's not you. It is the software that we're using for the lunch with Nima. So let's go to the next one. Have you looked at any data around how marketing activities affect desired outcomes? That's a big one.
It's a big one, yes. First of all, marketing activities affect desired outcomes. The question about data on that is, so when I was at the Museum of Science, I was associate director of marketing and the theaters, and we spent a lot of money marketing Ramses the Great, and it had a huge impact. And Ramses the Great was, for a period of time, pervasive in the Boston culture in 1988. So there was a big impact on awareness of Ramses the Great. Is that something that the Museum of Science's main mission was about? Well, you know, we added a lot about remote sensing, and we added a lot about how archaeology and other sciences were investigating how these things were used, and about the pyramids, and plenty about mummies. But so we know from a on-the-ground basis that the marketing that we did in that project had a significant impact on outcomes. The data for it, I mean, it's a very good question. I could show you the shelves behind me that talk about all the market research that we have done for clients and for the Museum of Science when I was there with visitor studies, that indicate that the kind of impact that motivates visitation is first word of mouth, and that's usually around mid 60% of why they came. And then eventually advertising and other sources. But everybody's most proud of saying, I came because a friend told me I should come. Very few people feel as comfortable saying, I came because it was really a great ad and I was seduced by the ad. Nevertheless, there is a percentage of that appears in almost all these studies, somewhere in the 30s or 40s. And in fact, it may be higher. The problem is that none of those studies are generalizable. It's a study for, I don't know, an IMAX theater in Fort Worth. It's a study for Body Worlds in Science Museum of Minnesota. It's a study for Ramses in Provo, Utah. And they're also private. So we can't take all the marketing data and conjoin it the way we've been able to do that with visitor research. The Visitor Studies Association has been a great platform for all the qualitative research to be conjoined and shared on places like informalscience.org, but there is no equivalent for sharing marketing data, which is regarded as proprietary and confidential by its commissioners, as it were, by the museums that have done it. So if whoever the questioner is wants to start that, please do. Get everybody to share marketing data and findings.
Okay, so I have another one that's involving membership. When surveying your membership, are there some best practices to follow? Limited questions, better to survey in person, by email, or both, different times of the year?
I'll say at the outset, it's not an area that I know a lot about. We haven't done a great deal of specific research on membership ways of doing it. I will quote the COVE's research on surveys. COVE's is the collaboration of visitor experience studies that is run by the Museum of Science in Boston. They're trying to standardize visitor experience questions into one instrument. And one of the things that they did was to run a set of tests about where to do surveys. And they tested 3 options: outside the building on exiting surveys, inside the building toward the end, and through internet with people who agreed to do a follow-up internet. And they found from that the best way to talk to visitors was toward the end of their survey inside the building, that they got a higher response rate, that they were able to get more dwell time from them, more time on task, and they even were able to see that the results, for some reason, were more valid. So I would extrapolate from that talking to members in the building when they're there will result in more and better information. But that's kind of, I'm speculating at this point.
Okay,
yes.
So Susan Funk had a question, and she said, great session. Our visitor cultural profile is aligned with the local population, but we are interested in expanding the visitor diversity. I think we all struggle with this. How do you define and measure diversity goals without asking people to self-identify?
Yeah, this is, a lot of people have spent time on this, and I'll again go back to COVE's. COVE's, which represents a network of, I don't know, order of magnitude of 10 or 15 museums across the United States, has wrestled with this in various workshops and back and forth, and they have come up with a question that addresses racial and gender and cultural categories. Having said that, the census is also wrestling with this, and my suggestion would be to at least align with the census and how they do it. And the census is then interpreted by many commercial organizations like Alteryx and a couple of other sources. The reason to do that is that the only way you can compare your museum to your community is to have some kind of a a benchmark, and the census has that benchmark. What's critical for the museum to understand is that not all of your audience is from that community. So your share of any one category, take Asian Americans, say, is not necessarily representative of the number of Asian Americans in your community, because the tourists may have a different share, and your own institution may skewer who's coming. If you're more adult, you're not going to get your share of the children's audience, or vice versa. So you have to filter your diversity somewhat. If you're a general museum, then yeah, maybe you should be matching the community. But even whether you choose to match or not match, it is a useful indicator because it's firm ground. If the U.S. Census numbers are pretty solid, so you may not want to get 100% there or feel that you need to get 100% there, but you can certainly move from where you are toward that goal and measure the improvement as you try to reach that goal, even though it may be hard to do. You know, if you are, for instance, in 1 or 2 languages, you're not likely to be able to get 100% speak those 2 languages. Are there more questions? Is that...
John, are you still there?
Yeah. Yes, I am. Sorry.
Yep. Are you familiar with Data Arts at all?
Very much so, and in contact with them.
Okay.
The Cultural Data Project, yeah.
Yep, the Cultural Data Project. So we do have a question of, would you recommend using their Data Arts profile to fill out the flow chart and then expand from there? And do you consider Data Arts a useful tool? And I should say that Data Arts is actually done on Lunch with Nima, so if you do want to see that webinar, you can just go to the NEMA website and look under Lunch with Nima, and you can see the one that we did, I think, last year. So they went through their Data Art profile if anybody was wondering about Data Arts.
Great. So first, Data Arts, when they were the Cultural Data Project, were involved in our effort to survey all the surveys that were dealing with the museum field, the museum directory, the AAM, Data Arts, all the other ones. And their database went into the first database we created so that all their questions are represented in MIP 1.0. Having said that, that was all their original generation. They have since redone their questions. While they've sent me copies of those, we have not issued MIP 2.0, which will simply add more data fields to it. But in this project that Heather mentioned earlier, the Assessing Museum Impact project, where we're working with NEMA and 9 museums to see if the use of indicators actually helps them improve their impact over a course of a year or so. In that project, we're encouraging people, if they're already filing with Data Arts, to use those data fields in their analysis if it works for them. Rather than inventing a new data field that requires more effort differently, and that actually reduces the ability for that museum to compare themselves to others. Data Arts is offered to run comparisons of museums to other peers. Yes, we believe that Data Arts is a good organization, that filing with them is important. We're supporting their efforts to try to actually provide services to the other museum associations that are finding it a burden to collect data directly. So there may be more roles for them. But they have to figure out a business model. That's a big challenge for them.
Yeah, no, what they're collecting is very useful and stuff like that, especially to just nonprofits in general in the museum community and stuff. So we are coming up to the 1 o'clock hour. Does anybody have any last-minute questions for John? He's also available. I can post his information on the NEMA website. Again, this is recorded, and his presentation and the PowerPoint will be available probably a little later. I still need to eat my lunch, so it might be a little later this afternoon.
And Heather, feel free to post my email, jjacobsen@whiteoakassociates.com, and I can answer one-on-one questions if that works, given time. I may not get back to it for a day or two.
Yeah, given time. And then, so John, I want to say thank you, and I want to say thank you to everybody that joined us today for Lunch with NEMA. We will be having one in September, and NEMA's Executive Director, Dan, will be giving his to perfect your elevator speech and networking prowess just in time for the NEMA conference in October. Just a reminder, our conference is a little bit earlier this year, so our early bird deadline is a little bit earlier too. So join us in October, at the end of October in Falmouth on the Cape, and hope to see you guys all either at the next Lunch with NEMA or at conference. Thanks again, everybody, and thank you, John.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you all. Much appreciated.
Okay, we will see you at another one then. Thanks.
Great.